Good evening, everybody. So you're all very welcome to this webinar brought to you by the Roscommon Longford region. So my name is Alan O'Brien. I'm an advisor based in Castlerea, and this is the third webinar out of our series of five webinars. So just before we start, there's an event that we'd just like to let you know about, and that's the Roscommon Sheep Seminar, which is coming up this Thursday evening in the Abbey Hotel in Roscommon. So it's on Thursday evening, 8 o'clock. And the topics that are going to be covered in the night are nutrition, pre and post lambing, and that's going to be covered by Damien Costello, a Teagasc sheep specialist. Then we have a market outlook for 2025 covered by David Mannion of Keepack. And finally, then Michael Conroy is going to give a sheep schemes update. So that's a must attend event really for any sheep farmers out there. And it's this Thursday, the Abbey Hotel in Roscommon. So I'm joined this evening by Kieran Kenny, who's an ASSAP advisor covering Longford and Roscommon. And we have Brian Daly, who's an advisor based in Roscommon. And then we have Donall Fahy, who's an advisor based in Ballinasloe. And Donall is going to cover the questions that people may have. So tonight we're going to have Kieran, who's going to discuss regulations and changes in relation to water quality. Brian then is going to talk about fertiliser planning. And then after that, Brian is going to come back and give us an update on herd number application. So just to give an idea of the format for this evening, the webinar is going to last for approximately 1 hour. And it's a slightly different format this evening than we've had on other evenings. So we're going to start off with Kieran's presentation on water quality, and then that's going to be followed by Brian's presentation on fertiliser planning. And then we're going to have questions on those two topics. And once we finish the questions on those topics, Brian is going to come back again and cover herd number application. And then we'll deal with questions on that. So just to let you know that the webinar, it's been recorded. So for anyone who wants to look back on it again, it'll be available on YouTube, and there'll also be links to it on the social media platforms, Facebook and X. So just before we start then, any questions that you may have, if you just pop them into the Q&A tab and we'll deal with them. We'll deal with them then at the end of the presentations. So with that then, I'll hand you over to Kieran and he'll share his screen there and start off with his presentation.
So tonight I want to deal with specifically the measures that are covered under regulation to impact water quality. There are other measures under other different schemes, such as acres, which we're all familiar with, and also the Farming for Water EIP. I suppose some of those measures are probably more specific in terms of what they can do or what impact they can have on the ground in terms of water quality. But regulation is a good starting point. It is a base in terms of trying to deal with issues on the ground. The other good thing about it, I suppose, it's compulsory and all farmers are included within it. But the one disadvantage, I suppose, it's not site specific. So setting a regulation, it's a one size fits all approach kind of thing. So I'll give an example of that weakness later on. So as I said, it's just regulation and I want to discuss tonight. So there's a few different areas in terms of where regulation is dealt with. The first relates to farmyard management. And as we all know, farmyards potentially can be a source of pollution. There's different things that must be managed well to prevent soil, water, organic manure such as slurry, and of course silage effluent from entering water. So we have to be careful in managing our facilities within the yard. The couple of big things, the big items, it's suggested and it's covered under regulation that you should be diverting rainwater. So rainwater would include clean water that's falling on roofs and also water that's falling on clean yards. So both of those should be diverted, probably directly through a pipe system to an open drain, or if there's no open drains, then into a soak pit. If you have a soiled yard where there's animals maybe having access to a yard, then obviously you can't let that water make its own way off the yard. You have to collect that in some sort of a tank. But the important thing with that is that you should minimize the volumes of soil water that's produced and that have to be collected. So the issue there might be ensuring that any clean yards are separated from the soil yards. So make sure that the water is separated. The other big risk item, of course, on a yard is the drain, the open drain that leaves the yard. So if there is an open drain, it's important that it's only clean water that's entering that channel, because that open drain obviously connects to maybe a stream further down and eventually into a river. So you want to make sure that that's only clean water that's entering that water body. In relation to the collection and storage of organic manures, as you know, you have to ensure that the facilities, the sheds, and the tanks, etc., are in good working order, and that there's no seepage or runoff from these facilities. There's a capacity requirement for tanks, for instance, with organic manures such as slurry. You have to have a minimum requirement of 18 weeks storage for the winter. And as Brian will discuss later on, there's a fair chance that 18 weeks will actually increase in the short term. There's also a requirement for storage of farmyard manure. You can field store farmyard manure, but not during the prohibited period for animal manure, for the spreading of animal manure. So for that 10-week period over the winter months, you cannot put the manure in the field or store it in the field. If you were storing it in the yard on a concrete base or on gravel, you obviously have to have a facility to collect any seepage. So during the spreading period in the field, the important item is that you cannot locate it within 20 meters of a water body, or indeed from a lake. In relation to the storage of silage bales, there was a change made there in the last year. No longer can you stack them more than 2 high, and you can't stack them within 20 meters of a water body, unless there are storage facilities in place to collect any potential effluent. So that rule relates to both field storage and also within the farmyard. So there must be at least 20 meters from a water body, unless you have a facility to collect the potential effluent. Now, many of these regulation items here that are related to nutrient management, Brian will deal with these in more detail in his presentation. So there are requirements in relation to soil sampling and preparing a nutrient management plan. And indeed, most farmers will have that done at this now, be it part of an environmental scheme or as a requirement under regulation. Any farmer above 130 kgs of stocking rate is supposed to take soil samples and prepare some sort of a plan. Fertiliser rates, be it organic or chemical fertiliser rates, relates to the actual stocking rate on the farm, and Brian will discuss that again. There are limits for organic matter soils. If you're farming on peat soils and they're above 20% organic matter, then there's serious restrictions in terms of the phosphorus that you're allowed to apply. Again, Brian will discuss that. If you're above 100 kgs per hectare of stocking rate from 2025 onwards, then all the slurry that's produced on the farm must be applied using a low emission slurry spreading system. If you're importing or exporting organic manures, then the department have really tightened up on this. From this year, the exporter will have to apply online that he's submitting, or that he must submit an application online that he's exporting the slurry, and the importer then has 6 months to acknowledge the receipt of that slurry. Prohibited spreading periods, which we all have an issue with at certain times. These relate to the application of chemical, organic manures, and also soil water. So typically, you can see the table there on the right hand side. Typically, for organic manure such as slurry, in Zone B, which includes Longford and Roscommon, the prohibited period starts on the 1st of October and finishes on the 15th of January for slurry. So the open period for slurry spreading starts on this Thursday coming. Just to explain the significance of the prohibited spreading period, not all farmers kind of understand this, and they have problems with it at times, but it is science-based, and that's the background to it. In terms of best practice in spreading slurry, it's important that the soil temperatures are 6 degrees above and constant, as in they're 6 degrees and rising. And also, it's important that you have reasonably good growth rates. So these two graphs here, if you look at over a period of time, if you look at the graph on the left-hand side, you can see that the months during the prohibited period of October, November, December, and January, you can see the soil temperatures are at their lowest there, particularly November, December, and January. So they're at 8-9 degrees and below. The graph on the right then looks at grass growth over a period of 4 years, from 2020 to 2023, and you can see that the grass growth drops off suddenly around the end of September, and it doesn't start picking up again until well into March. So outside of that period from early March up till the end of September, there's very little grass growth, and so it's not much use applying nutrients when there's no grass growth, and there's more of a risk that you're going to lose it. The other important thing relates to the rainfall. So we're looking at ground conditions during application of slurry, but also, and particularly important, is weather conditions post application. So this graph here looks at the long-term averages of rainfall during the period 1981 to 2010, and you can see again the 4 months of the prohibited period, October to January. They're the months where you have the highest rainfall, monthly rainfall, and also these will be the months where you have highest incidence of high rainfall events. So heavy rainfall, and typically met air and warnings for rainfall.
You have about 2 minutes left there, Kieran.
All right. The next slide then looks at the prohibited spreading period, and what we're suggesting here is the long-term average for evapotranspiration. You can see there's very low figures there for evapotranspiration. They're shown in the orange columns. So there's very low values for evapotranspiration again during those months, and because they're so low, in general, the soils are saturated during that period. So saturated soils is a no-no in terms of application of nutrients. Quickly then, the other ones relating to land management. You're not allowed to have a sacrifice paddock in terms of having animals out for the winter. And in relation to supplementary feeding, you cannot feed within 20 meters of a water body. Farm roadways, there is a risk of nutrient or sediment loss to farm roadways, so you have to put in measures now that you either camber the roadway away from the water body, or you put in an earthen bund to prevent it from flowing into the water body. In relation to cultivation of crops, There are a few issues here. You're not allowed to plough grassland from the 15th of October until the end of November. If you're putting in a tillage crop, you must leave an uncultivated buffer of 3 meters. And in relation to non-grass forage crops such as kale or fodder beet, you must leave a 4 meter vegetated buffer. For derogation farmers with stocking rates above 170 kgs, they must fence off water courses that are marked on OSI maps 1.5 meters of a distance, and water troughs have to be kept back 20 meters from the water bodies. The last thing I want to discuss is obviously buffer zones. This is probably the most important measure that's dealt with under regulations, and it's key in terms of trying to protect water quality. So there's buffer zones there for the application of pesticides, chemical fertilizer, and organic manures. In relation to pesticides, the minimum is 3 meters, but that can be more depending on what's on the label. So some chemicals will have a buffer of 5 meters, such as MCPA. Chemical fertilizer, again, is 3 meters minimum. So you have to keep back 3 meters from a water body when you're applying fertilizer. And organic manures, you can see the table there. The minimum buffer for organic manures is 5 meters. So in terms of spreading slurry, this time of the year, for the first 2 weeks of the open season and for the last 2 weeks of the season, that 5 meter buffer extends to 10 meters. So that's an important message. And to conclude, just a few messages. Regulation is important, but it's limited, I suppose. And I suppose the reason for this is there's a different approach maybe required for different scenarios. But yet you can only regulate. You can only have one regulation, so you can't really have regulation available for different scenarios. An example of that would be looking at poorly draining land versus free draining land. If you're given advice on application of slurry in both scenarios there, you would be given different types of advice, but you can't do that in terms of regulation. You're given the one regulation for both. To have an impact and protect water quality, then you need to have a large number of farmers collectively adhering to regulation within a catchment. As I said, the key measure in terms of water quality is buffers, and make sure that you implement the correct buffers in terms of application of nutrients, etc. And lastly, and we'll deal with this maybe on another webinar again, there are supplementary measures there to try and improve water quality where there's a pressure on water quality and where there's an actual problem, specific problem. There are measures there under EIPs, etc., that will specifically target certain measures in certain areas on the farm, such as critical source areas and areas where there's overland flow paths and delivery points, etc. That's me, Alan. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Kieran. And anyone with any questions for Kieran, you can keep typing them into the question and answer box there, and we'll get to them shortly. So after that, then we'll hand over to Brian, who's going to talk about fertilizer. He's going to talk about fertilizer application for the presentation.
Okay, hello, and Brian Daly is my name here, based in the Roscommon office. So look, what I'm going to talk to you briefly about over the next 15 or so minutes is just the importance of nutrient management plan, particularly with all the regulatory requirements that are out there now in relation to the nitrates derogation, or nitrates directive, and possibly derogation if you require one of them. So again, why bother with more paperwork and expense? Because there is obviously more paperwork when you're talking about a nutrient management plan, and there's a certain cost to getting one of them drawn up. But it is an awful lot to do with the legislative changes, particularly to the nitrates directive, and that's a constantly movable feast. So it's there's new regulations coming in on a constant basis. So it's important to keep on top of them. Again, your fertilizer database, which we're all very much aware of now, that the fertilizer database is live, and the Department of Agriculture have access to it, so they know what you're buying and they know what you're spreading, and they're asking you what closing stocks you have. So it'd be very important to know what you're allowed to buy and what you can't buy, because there are so many different types of fertilizer that are out there, and you could get yourself into trouble very quickly if you're just buying it buying it in the blind. Again, knowing what your grassland stocking rate is, and also there's a whole farm stocking rate that's out there as well, and there's a certain amount of confusion about it for the vast majority of the people here in our unit that would be on this webinar tonight. It's your grassland stocking rate, but if you have tillage or if you're importing or exporting some slurry, your whole farm stocking rate will differ from your grassland stocking rate. Again, from the low emission slurry spreading compliance under nitrates, there's some major changes in that after coming in January 25. So we'll go through that briefly. Again, Kieran mentioned it earlier on, soil sampling requirements and the organic matter and peat layer requirements. They are also very important, and they're something that people may be unaware of, and we'll try and touch on it briefly and answer any questions you might have on that. Again, water quality legislation. Kieran is after giving you a talk on it there, so I won't delay on that. But also there's the climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. So they're all, as they say, the major topics of the day, and we need to address them while we're doing our farming from day to day. So again, what is it all about? Basically, your grassland stocking rate is what is the common term that's used nowadays, and basically it's just a different method of expressing your stocking rate. Whereas people traditionally would have maybe talking about cow per acre or livestock unit per hectare. We're kind of gone away from that as such now, and you'd be talking about kgs of organic nitrogen per hectare. So it relates to the amount of nitrogen from the livestock only. It's not your chemical fertilizer. It's only what is produced by the livestock on your farm. So everyone's grassland stocking rate can be different and will be different depending on how heavily stocked you are and the amount of land that you're running. So again, to give you a quick example, a suckler cow there produces 65 kgs of organic N per year, and a 0 to 1 year old produces 24 kgs of nitrogen per year. So if you have a 25 hectare grassland farm with 40 sucklers and hopefully 40 whalelands on an annual basis, it's very easy to work out what your grassland stocking rate is. You have 40 by 65, 40 by 24, you add the two of them together and you come up with 3,560 kgs of organic N. You divide that by the amount of total hectares of the farm, which is 25 hectares in this case, and you're working out at a grassland stocking rate of 142.4 kgs of N, which is a fairly well-stocked farm, to put it mildly, in this part of the world. So from a nitrate stocking rate for this farm, our grassland stocking rate is 142.4. A whole farm stocking rate would be exactly the same, and in this case scenario, but if this farm had 10 hectares of tillage, the whole farm stocking rate would be significantly lower than the grassland stocking rate. And that's basically the best way of explaining it. The only, the only difference between grassland and whole farm stocking rate is if a person has another enterprise like tillage or is importing or exporting slurry. Okay. So again, just I suppose to try and explain it again for a second time, grassland stocking rate is the organic N from your grazing livestock divided by the grassland area on your farm. The whole farm stocking rate is the grazing livestock, again, the organic N that's produced from them, by the total area farmed, which can be different in some cases. And it's plus or minus your imports or exports then, because if you're exporting slurry, you're exporting what they regard as chemical nitrogen and chemical phosphorus in organic form. And if you're importing it, it's the same as buying a chemical fertilizer, because you're bringing in N and P. So your grassland stocking rate determines what your chemical fertilizer allowances are for the farm. That's what that's your allowances for your chemical are determined by the grassland stocking rate on an annual basis. So it's the previous year's grassland stocking rate is where this figure comes from. So to break it down, your 2024 grassland stocking rate, which is just a couple of weeks ago, it finished, obviously we're in a new year, will determine your 2025 chemical fertilizer allowances. So if you go in on ag food now and you look for your 2024 grassland stocking rate, it won't be up yet because the department haven't finalised the December figures, but you would be able to see your 2023 finalised figures, and you could see what your allowances were for 2024. That figure will be available in the next 2 to 3 weeks. It'll be certainly up by the end of January. So that will determine how much chemical fertiliser or what your allowances are in 2025. And I'll explain that in the next slide. And again, this is one that will catch a lot of people out, or they mightn't have been aware of it. It also drives your other requirements, which is your low emission slurry spreading. So Kieran mentioned it briefly earlier on, and I'll emphasize it here again in a few moments, is that anyone that's stocked their grassland stocking rate is greater than 100 kgs of nitrogen to the hectare are obliged. It's mandatory now that you have to spread your slurry by low emission slurry methods. Again, there has been a change to the soil analysis, or the soil sampling, as it's commonly known. You have to take one soil sample for every 5 hectares of your farm that you declare on your single farm payment, and them soil samples are only valid now for 4 years. And this is in situ since the 1st of January 2018, but people mightn't realise that, or haven't soil sampled in the last couple of years. You want to be aware of this going forward. Another thing that came in then is the organic matter layers, and as you can see on the map of Ireland there on the right hand side of the slide, the areas in brown are where there is an indicative layer of potential peat soils. So when we're looking at mapping out farms for soil sampling, we'll always turn on this layer, and if there's indication that there is a potential peat layer on your farm, we will ask you to do an extra test on that soil sample to test for organic matter. And if that organic matter comes back at greater than 20%, you have to assume index 3 on your soil for phosphorus. So there's a limiting factor there. But if the soil sample comes back at less than 20%, it reverts back to being a mineral soil, and you can avail of your full phosphorus allowances. Now, the good news is that you only have to do this soil organic matter test once every 12 years. So that's one every 3 sets of soil samples if you're using the soil samples for their full duration of every 4 years. Again, based on your stocking density, which you can see on the left-hand side, and the first 3 lines here are the ones that 98% of the farmers will be fall into one of these categories. You're either at less than 85 kgs of organic N, somewhere between 86 and 130, which the vast majority of people are. And then for the more heavily stocked farms, you're between 130 and 170. You can see there, based on the soil index, soil results that come back, you're either in index 1, index 2, index 3, or index 4, and there's different allowances in relation to the amount of phosphorus that you can spread. Obviously, if you're index 1, you have a higher allowance because your soil is crying out for some phosphorus to be spread on it to improve the fertility. We'd be recommending that. But again, you can see it also relates back to your stocking rate. There's no need for someone that's lowly stocked at less than 85 kgs to be lurrying out chemical fertilizer, because you don't have any great need for it. And maybe index 2 is as far as you need to be, whereas index 3 is the preferred index for optimum soil fertility. Again, down lower, that's above 170, that's for derogation farmers, and there isn't that many of them in our region, so I won't go into that. As I say, we'll keep going. Again, penalties for overuse of your chemical nitrogen and your phosphorus, and people say, sure, how will they know? They will know now because of the fertilizer database, and it's very easy. If you don't have a nutrient management plan, or you don't have up-to-date soil samples, to overuse your chemical fertilizers. And while you might say less than 10% overuse is only a 1% penalty, it's very easy to go over the 10% and fall into that 10 to 30% category, where there's a 3% penalty. And that penalty is across all of your direct payments. So that can mount up very quickly. And you know, it's something that we want to try and avoid at all costs, because the money is hard enough got, and it's hard enough to make a profit without having to give it back for overspreading our chemical fertilizers because we didn't know any better. Again,
About
the
2 more
fertilizer.
minutes, Brian.
Yeah, okay, thanks, Alan. The fertilizer register, as you can see there, that's just a snapshot of a certain individual, the amount of fertilizer that they bought this year. That's up on the Department of Agriculture's website. Okay, so they know exactly what you're buying and they know the type of fertilizer you're buying. And lime also, if you happen to be spreading lime. So again, people will say, sure, they'll never know. They do know, and they will be enforcing this on a more regular basis, and there will be checking to make sure that people fill in their closing stock, or else you won't be allowed to buy chemical fertilizer the following year before if you don't fill in your closing stock from the previous year. So I want to go through a couple of examples here very quickly in relation to soil samples and the need for them. So again, I'm going back to this 25-hectare farm, but we can see that this man has 25 suckler cows. He has 1 bull, he's 3 heifers in the 1 to 2 year old category, so you can see they're 57 kgs, and then he has 20 weanlings there at in the 0 to 1 category at 24 kgs. So his total organic nitrogen on that farm, produced on the farm in that calendar year, was 2149 kgs. You divide that by 25 hectares again, his stocking rate was fairly low at 86 kgs. Okay. If he has no soil samples, he has to assume index 3. He's not allowed to assume index 1 or index 2. Because he's under 130, he's allowed to assume index 3. So he has a small chemical phosphate allowance of 175 kgs because it's 25 by 7. His nitrogen, he falls into the category, there's 2 categories for nitrogen. So he's under 130, so he's allowed 114 kgs of nitrogen to the hectare, okay, which works out at 2850. If you break that down, it works out at approximately 2.9 tons of 18612 and 8.5 tons of CAN. However, if he had valid soil samples taken and they came back with 10 hectares of them at index 2 for phosphorus and 15 hectares at index 3, you can see that them figures change rather dramatically. And the index 2 allowance gives them 17 kgs of phosphorus per hectare, so that's 170, plus the index 3 allowances at 7 kgs by 15 works out at 105. So he's allowed 275 kgs of phosphorus. His nitrogen figure doesn't change, that's not affected. So now he's allowed 4.5 tons of 18612 on that farm. Same land, right? Just with valid soil samples, he has a greater scope and he has less chance of getting himself into trouble because he has a nutrient management plan and he knows that he could buy up to 4.5 tons of 18612. If I bring this on to a more heavily stocked farmer, same farm, but this man has 40 suckler cows, again, a bull, 6 heifers, and 24 0 to 1 year olds. Same size farm, that works out a stocking rate of 143 kgs per hectare. Again, with no soil samples, he's not allowed to buy any compound fertilizer under law, under the nitrates law. He's prohibited. Once you're stocked above 130, you have to assume index 4 for phosphorus because you do not have valid soil samples. So his nitrogen, he is allowed to spread nitrogen, and you can see there, because he's at the higher stocking rate, he's allowed 185 kgs of nitrogen per hectare. So he's allowed approximately 17 ton a can, but no phosphorus. Okay. If he had soil samples, and again, you can see there's a number of them at index 3, where there's an allowance of 13 kgs of phosphorus, and there's a couple of soil samples at index 2, which is a higher allowance at 23 kgs of phosphorus. So the two of them combined gives us an allowance of 425 kgs of phosphorus. So now the nitrogen figure stays the same. So now that man can spread up to 7 tons of 18612 and 12.5 ton a can because he had valid soil samples within the valid 4 years. So that's the importance of having valid soil samples and having them into a nutrient management plan. At least you know where you're going when you go to the co-op or you go to your supplier and you want to buy chemical fertilizer. You have some idea, well, you have a great idea of what you need, what you can buy and what you need to buy. So issues going into the future, and this will be very quick now. Kieran talked about water there, water quality a few minutes ago. Water quality trends are dropping. They're not going in the right direction, they're going in the wrong direction. And the EPA determined that. So that will provide challenges for the nutrient and the nitrates action plan going forward. And already you can see from last year, there was some changes there for the guys that are in derogation. They, they can no longer stock up to 250 now. They have to stock under 220. That came in 2024. And there's potential further changes coming down the line in maybe this year or certainly into 2026. Now, one that will really hit home, and again, is something you need to be aware of. You can see there in the next slide down, January 2025, anyone that stocked at greater than 100 kgs of nitrogen to the hectare, their grassland stocking rate is higher than 100 kgs from last year, they have to spread their slurry with low emission slurry spreading equipment. Okay, that's new. And also on top of that, they have to have a minimum storage requirement from January 2025 of 18 weeks. So what that means is that for the bovine animals that are in your farm, you have to have full storage capacity for them in your sheds, be it in your slatted tanks, regardless of whether you have them stocked in the shed or not. You might be out wintering a few of them. It makes no difference. Whatever stock you have on hand, you have to have full storage capacity for them for the full 18-week period of the close period. And for the ovines or sheep, that's 6 weeks. Okay. Again, review of slurry and soil water storage requirements are ongoing in 23-24. Slurry requirement is likely to increase from currently 0.33 cubic meters per cow up to 0.4. It hasn't come into law yet. And again, there is potential changes, covering of external stores and changes to soil water requirements, which are predominantly for the dairy side of the house. And again, there is a change coming in the nitrogen figure for young stock for 2024. It's falling from 24 kgs of nitrogen per animal down to 21, but that's not yet signed into law. Okay. Again, for those of you that might be meal feeding during the summer, if you are meal feeding, you're no longer allowed to feed any greater than 14% crude protein while they're out at grass. When they're coming back into the yard, when they're housed, you can revert back to a 16 or 17% crude protein. But while they're out at grass, going forward now, for all farmers, you can't feed any greater than 14% crude protein in the meal that you're giving to the animals at grass. Again, land that's greater than 30 kilometres away from the main farm holding is now limited to 170 from 2025. That's a new one, so that may affect those that are more heavily stocked or their derogation farmers, and the next one applies to derogation farmers as well. There's a 4-day rule for slurry exports that has come in and it's gone live now, and that's a big change where the exporter when he puts it up on the system for verification, it has to be verified within 4 days when he puts it up. Again, clover use on all farms. So people that are doing any reseeding going forward and stuff like that, they will have to incorporate some version of white clover or red clover into their swards. And there is a potential going forward. It's been suggested. I don't know whether it's going to happen or not. We won't know until later on this year. But could be coming off the market from September 2025, and people will be obliged to spread protected or unprotected urea. Okay. So a couple of quick take-home messages. A nutrient management plan, the importance of it, it addresses all of these issues that myself and Kieran are after raising. Okay. The thing is, do you know your grassland stocking rate at home and what fertilizer allowances you have for 2025? Your nutrient management plan will tell you that if you ask us to do up one for you. And remember, if you are on ag food and you're looking at your grassland stocking rate, that is only the bovine grassland stocking rate. You need to add in the ewe flock if applicable to your farm. So those lads are looking at your ag food and you go into your nitrogen and phosphorus statements and you see that your grassland stocking rate is 90 and you have 100 ewes at home, you have to incorporate the 100 ewes into that as well. So that'll bring you well over the 100 kgs of nitrogen. And again, from the 1st of January 2025, the grassland stocking rate, again, can't emphasize this enough. If you've gone over the 100 kgs of nitrogen per hectare in 2024, low emission slurry spreading is mandatory in 2025. and you have to have a full 18 weeks of storage required for your bovines. So I know I went through that fairly quickly, but hopefully if you have any questions, we'll try and answer them as best we can, and hopefully it makes some sense. Thank you.
Thanks, Brian. So we'll just go to Donald now and he'll run through the questions that have come in for Brian and Kieran.
Yeah, so look, I tried to summarize the questions there as good as I could, and there's just two remaining questions there for Kieran at the minute. The first one is going back to why wasn't the slurry spreading period extended last October when ground conditions were so good? And I suppose to follow on to that then as well, what are the penalties for not complying with regulation if the farmer was found in breach, I suppose, of causing pollution to a nearby watercourse?
Right. The first question in relation to the why the slurry season wasn't extended, that can vary from 1 year to year, and the minister takes the approach, I suppose, it depends on the opportunities for spreading slurry coming up to the date. And it was felt that there was ample opportunities, particularly in September. It was a difficult summer, particularly July and August, but September was reasonably okay in terms of spreading slurry. That's why it wasn't extended.
Okay.
In relation to the penalties, there are penalties. The department will set penalties if they have an inspection and they find an issue. The range of penalties, it depends on the actual non-compliance, but the penalties can range from typically they start at 3% and they can go up to 20%. Now, they have an opportunity then of reducing it or increasing it. So the 3% penalty can be reduced to 1% or increased to 5%, whereas a 20% penalty can also be increased or reduced, and that depends on the situation, and it depends on whether the penalty is considered intent or non-intent. And also then there's issues then that going forward again, if there's a repeat offence, you can find yourself in a higher penalty situation as well.
Just one final question there then for you, Kieran. What's the role of the county council and completing farm inspections?
The county council, there will be a greater role going forward because for a number of years there, the county council have had very few staff on the ground, but they have increased nationally. They have increased their staff, and so the department will be using them maybe for some of their inspections, but the local authority will also be targeting a number of inspections, and they do look at specific areas or specific risk areas in terms of targeting inspections. So they might look at higher stocked farmers, or they could look at maybe an area where there's a particular problem, a long-term issue. They might target that area as well.
Okay. That's all the questions for you there, Kieran. No, so it is.
Thank you.
Brian, I have a good few questions now coming in here as regards soil sampling. What time of year should soil samples be taken, and how long are they valid for?
Well, I suppose I'll answer the second part of it first. They're valid for 4 years from when they're approved. So generally, when you get your soil samples taken and we log them and sent away, they come back from the laboratory around 10 to 12 working days afterwards. They're valid for 4 years from that date. The best time to take them is always at the back end of the year from October onwards, because you have all your chemical fertilizer spread and the close period is in operation for 6 or 7 weeks at that stage. But any time really up until March. But if you are spreading organic manure or something in the next couple of weeks, it'd be much preferable to get your soil samples taken before you start travelling the land with organic manures or chemical manure.
Okay. Yeah. There's another question there in So I'm involved in acres. Does this limit the amount and quantity and the type of fertilizer that I'm allowed to spread?
Yes, if again, it depends on what you picked when you went into the acre scheme along with your advisor. If you have low input grasslands, you are limited to 30 kgs of nitrogen to the hectare, but you're not limited in relation to your P's and K's, depending on the soil sample results. So anyone that would be in the acre scheme, one of the key things in acres is that you have to have valid soil samples. So be it acres 1 or acres 2, you would have your soil samples taken or about to be taken, and you're allowed to follow the phosphorus and potash advice, but you are limited in them circumstances on that type of grassland to 30 kgs of nitrogen to the hectare.
Okay. Just there's a question there as well. Will every farmer need a nutrient management plan?
It's not mandatory, and for those that are fairly lowly stocked, that quite possibly won't need one. But what I would recommend is that for all farmers to have valid soil samples, because
Okay.
it solves an awful lot of problems if you have a set of valid soil samples, particularly in relation to lime, as well as your P's and K's and nitrogen that I've been talking about earlier on. If you only spread lime itself and got your soil pHs right, you would reap the benefit of that many times over. So the soil sample is a no-brainer. It's value for money 100 times over, and it gives you some indication of what the fields can and can't produce based on them results.
Okay. Another question there. Does the information that I supplied on the sheep census on the 31st of December affect my whole farm stocking rate?
It affects your grassland stocking rate, which in a grassland scenario, if you're a full grassland farmer, that is your whole farm stocking rate because
Yeah.
of grassland. So your sheep information is tied in. So the information that you supplied at the end of 2023, at the start of 2024, feeds into your grassland stocking rate for 2024 from the department. And the current census that you're filling in at the moment, whether you have it submitted or not, you still have a bit of time to do that. That will impact on your 2025 grassland stocking rate at the end of the year. But that is what how the department track the sheep numbers is on the census. So yes, it does feed directly into grassland stocking rate and hence whole farm stocking rate.
And then, Brian, just the final question there for you then. Where in Ag Food can I find my stocking rate figures?
Yeah, so if you have access to your Ag Food account, there's a tab there called the nitrogen and phosphorus statements. It's just one of the many tabs as you scroll down the thing. If you click on that, it will automatically bring you to your to the nitrogen phosphorus statement, and you can tap it. You will see it straight in front of you. You'll have it goes back 6 or 7 years, so you can follow at the end of 2022, 23, 24, and so forth and so on. But at the moment, as we speak, as of this evening, the final 2024 figures aren't up because the department need about 3 to 4 weeks to finish off the December figures, and then they will put up the whole of 2024 grassland stocking rate. So, but you can track your 23 and so forth and so on.
Just one final question there then, Brian.
Yeah.
When spreading lime and organic manure on a field in spring, is it
Yes.
safer to graze or cut meadow off the field after?
What we would say to you is organic manure in the spring is no problem, but lime is, especially if you have that earmarked for cutting silage later on in the year, you need a number of months for the lime to be fully absorbed into the ground. If the silage contractor or whatever breaks ground, or if weather conditions are poor and soil is exposed and that comes in with the round bale or in with the pit silage, the lime is still there active in the soil, and it can inhibit the pH in the silage. So you mightn't get a very good preservation. So what we would always try and encourage, but it's fine if the field's only going to be grazed that year, But what we would always try and encourage people to do is spread the lime at the back end of the year, so you have the full winter for the lime to be absorbed, and then you can cut silage the following April, May, June time, and there won't be any issues.
That's all the questions here.
Okay.
That's great, Donald. So we'll go back to Brian again now. He's going to take us through the herd number application and the new changes and new regulations that are along with it now.
Find here. So I'll just drive on to this, guys. Now, I suppose this is there's been a couple of changes now that the department announced there just in the month of December, and they have been became applicable since the first 2025. There's a new ER1 document. Okay, for those of you that are going in for a new herd number or changes to your herd number, it's a new ER1 document. It's available to download online. The filling it in online isn't available yet. They foresee that they will make that available in the next year or two, but currently you still have to download that document and fill it in by hand. Okay, so the first major change there is that there's a new definition, and operator, which is under EU regulation, is the proper term now. So you will be a herd operator rather than a herd keeper or a herd owner. Operator is the term that's going to be used going forward. Okay, but keeper and owner are still there in the background. The big change here is for new herd number applications, they must have the following in situ prior to submission of their application. And this is where the change is that a permanent isolation facility with a concrete floor, a roof structure, and adequate electrical and watering facilities must be in place before you submit an ER1 form. In relation to bovine herd numbers, okay, they also must have in situ a permanent fixed handling facility with a suitable pollution control and concrete floor. Okay, so if you're going just for a bovine herd number, you have to have both of them before you submit your application. If you have a sheep, if you're applying for a sheep flock number or an ovine flock number, your handling facilities can be mobile, but the mobile equipment must be suitable for flock management purposes. But you still have to have your permanent isolation facility in situ also. So again, that's a big change, and it's something that people will have to get used to, is that you have to have these things in situ now prior to the application. All applications going forward must be accompanied with a proof of identity, a map of the holding, and documents showing legitimate use of the lands. So that means that if you own land, you have to supply the folios with the folio maps in your name. If you have leased land, them leases have to be attached with the application, and they have to be stamped and cleared by revenue. And if you have some rental land as well, or Conacre land, along with owned or leased, they have to have a signed rental agreement. Okay, so that's new also. And again, which would needless to say, companies and farm partnerships will require extra documentation, because obviously companies will need a list of the directors and so forth, and the farm partnership has to be a registered farm partnership, and that has to be stamped and sealed as well, or signed as well. Okay, in relation to joint herd numbers, at least one operator must be owner of land. So one of the two names, or however many names, at least one operator must be owner of the land. And again, here's another change that kind of caught me off guard at the time, is the witness must be independent. So it has to be a commissioner of oaths, a guard, a peace commissioner, etc., etc. Previously, agricultural advisors could be the witness, be the Teagasc or a private advisor or consultant. That is no longer the case. We're not allowed to sign these forms on behalf of farmers anymore. All lease land must be greater than 1 year in duration. Okay, so if you are putting in an application and you have a lease that's been run down, you may need to extend that lease. The lease has to be greater than 1 year in duration. and they also flagged on the meeting that I was at that a possible suspension of herd number it could happen if lease dates aren't updated and notified to the relevant DVO offices. So as your leases run out going forward into the future, if you fail to get them leases updated and new dates extended, etc., and you don't notify the DVO, if they bring that up on their computer, they could potentially suspend the herd number. Okay, but hopefully now that mightn't be the case. So again, if you're adding a young trained farmer to a herd number, okay, there's some essential info that's required. Again, for the ER1 application, which is the application when you're putting it into the department, you need the joint bank account details of the applicants, including the BIC and IBAN numbers. So it's very important, if you're thinking of putting your son or daughter on the herd number, or your husband or wife, or whatever the case may be, and the whole lot, you have to set up a joint bank account, and that has to be the main farm account, and the BIC and IBAN numbers have to be supplied. They have to be in the same name as what's going in on the ER1 application. And on top of that, then, essential documents required for your BIS 2025 application, which again is only around the corner, guys, is the joint bank account header statement, including the names on it, and they have to match the herd number. Okay, your level 6 qualification document has to be provided. A declaration of undertaking has to be provided, which has to be signed and stamped by a solicitor in the company of the young farmer who's been added to the herd number. Your effective control form, signed and stamped. A transaction receipt showing farming activity out of that joint bank account. So be it for a bag of nuts or a ton of fertilizer or whatever, it has to become you have to show banking activity coming out of that joint bank account. You have to show that transaction in a paper format, and it has to be uploaded on your BIS application, and also a bank statement showing that the money leaving that joint bank account. And on top of that, then you also more than likely, it's not even a probability, it's almost guaranteed that there's a transfer of entitlements to be completed, because the entitlements have to be taken out of the original herd number, the herd owner's name, be that Tom, and then they have to be put into the name of Tom and Joe, because Joe has been added to the herd number, or whoever the pair of people might be, or more names if that's the case, if that happens to be the case. Okay, so there's an awful lot of stuff there in relation to herd numbers. Okay, so again, all of the above take time, right? So it is time to act now. Speak to your advisor, whoever he or she may be, okay, because you will need to consult with your advisor more than once on this. You could take 2 or 3 consultations to get this sorted out. Changes to herd number or new applications can take up to 10 weeks to process once submitted into the Department of Agriculture. All applications in this region go to Cavan. So as they say, the busier they get in Cavan, getting closer to the BIS time of the year, the longer these things take to be processed. BIS 2025 will be soon upon us. So what I would recommend for anyone that is contemplating making any sort of a change to a herd number, be it the addition or subtraction of someone, or even if you're a first time putting in an ER1 form, I would strongly recommend that you ask for some guidance from a professional. Mistakes and delays can cause stress, anxiety, and financial strain. And look, it will take a couple of consultations to get all your T's crossed and your I's dotted. So look, I'll answer any questions you have on that, because I know we're gone well over time. So Alan, I'll take any questions. And
Yep, we'll go back to Donall there, and he'll read out any questions that come in on the herd numbers.
Yeah. So Brian, if I apply for a herd number in March and it's not granted before the BIS deadline, does this mean that I can't apply for BIS until next year?
No. thankfully, there is a facility that the department make available generally in the last week before the BIS deadline, where you can apply under a temporary reference number. But that, as I said, my last line there on my last slide, that will cause stress, anxiety, not only to the farmer, but also to the likes of ourselves, because that herd number application then has to be linked to that reference number later on in the year. And that can take a lot of time and it can cause a lot of complications in Portlaoise, where the BIS section don't marry up the reference number to the herd number. And it could cause delays in money later on in the year. But you can, in the worst case scenario, generally we try to avoid it, but in worst case scenario, if it's down to the last 2 or 3 days, we will be able to help you to put it in under a temporary reference number.
This is probably something similar. So it's an existing herd number, but the question is, what is the cut-off date if I want to add my daughter to it?
It's not so much a cut-off date, Donald, but what I would strongly recommend is instead of thinking about it, if it's a fairly certain that you're going to be adding your daughter to it, go into town, go into your local bank, set up a new bank account, because that takes time as well. Banks are very slow to process new bank accounts now. It takes 4, 5, 6 days, and it could take another 4, 5, 6 days after that to get an IBAN and IBAC number. So all of a sudden you're looking at another 2 or 3 weeks before you have that IBAN and big number. So what I would say is act quickly, go in and get the bank account set up, and then in the meantime, talk to your advisor or a professional, and you can start the process and start getting the other things lined up so that you can get the application as soon as possible. But if you don't have it done by Paddy's Day, St. Patrick's Day, I would say that you're running a very tight ship then.
Okay. There's a question here on facilities. So what would qualify as a permanent isolation facilities for bovines?
A shed structure, quite frankly. It has to have a concrete floor. It has to be a permanent structure. It has to have a roof. It has to have electricity, and it has to have water. So when you factor in all of the above, what we're basically talking about is a shed.
Okay. There's a question in there as well. Is there a maximum distance between land blocks to farm 2 blocks of land on the same herd number?
No. You very often, it was in the previous presentation that if you have land that's a long distance away, different rules apply to the main block of land in relation to grassland stocking rates that can be held, that can be farmed, as in if you're in derogation in one part of the country, you can't be in derogation in a different county. You have to farm that land at less than 170 grassland stocking rate. But in relation to having a separate herd number or another herd number, it would only be if you're in different regional DBO cases. So Galway would be a different regional DBO than Roscommon and Longford, which is connected to Cavan. So they may ask you to get a different herd number if you're based in Galway, if you have a lot of land and a lot of stock over in Galway, and you're also farming in Roscommon. But primarily, it's the place where your main block of land is, and where your main farmyard is. That's where you have your herd number, and that should be sufficient for the other blocks.
And just the last question there then, what's adequate for pollution control, I suppose, regarding the permanent isolation facilities?
Once there's a concrete floor in the shed, and because it's from a welfare point of view, as long as you have adequate straw under in the isolation facility for the animal to lie down and be comfortable, the straw will be sufficient from that perspective, from a pollution control point of view. If you go on to the handling facilities, what they're talking about in relation to pollution control there would be that you would have some way of cleaning down the facilities after use, either brush them down and take away the organic material, or that you have some sort of channels with a small effluent tank where you can direct that organic material into the tank and not have the rain falling down on it and that rainwater becoming slurry under the nitrates regulations.
Yeah.
Somewhere so that you can brush it down, clean it, brush it into a tank, so that the rainwater that falls on the concrete after that can drain away naturally and not be contaminated rainwater.
And I just think that'll probably answer the last question there that's after coming in. Will a slatted shed suffice as an isolation shed?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So look, there's no further questions there now to be answered anyways, okay?
That's okay.
That's great. So great to get all those questions answered. So that's nearly it now for this evening. So just again to remind people again about the sheep seminar that's coming up this Thursday evening in the Abbey Hotel in Roscommon at 8 o'clock, and all are welcome to attend that. And then, so there's going to be a webinar again this day next week. So next Monday, it'll be on at 8 o'clock again. And the topics for next week's webinar are rearing the dairy calf, and Tommy Cox, who's a dairy beef 500 specialist with Teagasc, will cover that. And then secondly, we're going to have John Donlan, who's a vet with Teagasc, is going to talk about preparing for spring calving on farms. So finally, then this evening, we'd just like to thank Brian, Kieran, and Donall for participating in the webinar. And that's it for this evening. So goodbye to everyone.